Coming up on Beyond the Vibe, we'll be discussing the best third albums of all time.
Oh, shit.
You've done it again. Hey.
We found it.
I'm going to do it. I'm going to do the bold. I'm going to make a bold decision here.
You make a bold one, eh?
It's to do with number 10.
Ooh.
So I'm literally changing it right now. I'll put this in the episode so people can see that I'm not just cheating, and that I'm literally changing my number 10 before we even start the video properly, because I just feel that this one's made more of an impact by the skin of its teeth.
Hey.
And you'll find out in a minute which one it is. Right, we've made a bold decision here.
Ooh, I'm
It's going to
intrigued.
send some shock waves.
Have you kicked someone off?
Yes, I've thrown somebody out at the death. Right before we're about to start. It was just a thought. Somebody came into my head, which I'll reveal. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. It's like the third and final album.
Oh.
And I'm like, I love both of these records, but I just feel that this third and final one might be that particular band's best work, whereas the one I've just kicked out, it's not his best, even though it's very good. Like, they're all extraordinary, quite frankly. I'm looking at this list and it's insane.
Like literally,
You wouldn't. I thought this would be the start of the decline. You know, like a third album. You think, oh, three deep.
no, but
you know.
literally, from like my number 10 is I like a classic album.
Yeah. Hello once again. We're back. Of course, last time we did the best second albums. You know, the bands that broke that sophomore album curse. You know, some bands they struggle with that second album. It was always that thing. But you know, we were discussing afterwards. We were like, you know, because the reception was so positive last time. We thought about third. You know, it just cast our minds to third albums. You know, it was like, do we have some classic third albums? And then we looked into it. I mean, I know me in particular. We looked into it and we discovered that there are wall-to-wall classic third albums. I mean, I initially thought, oh, maybe this is going to be kind of the downturn, you know, where things start to get a bit stale or whatever for certain bands, because, you know, they've done 2 killer records potentially. But this isn't the case. I mean, I'm sure you've had a similar conundrum, Lee.
Oh, absolutely, man. Like you said, I think we could have easily done like a top 30. Frankly,
Yeah.
it's there's a lot of pinnacle records that are that third album.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, I thought, oh, maybe it's going to be like, for the film fans out there, they always say the third movie. It's like, oh, it's not as good as the first two. You always get that comment, don't you? I thought, oh, maybe there's going to be a lot of that happening where it's like, it's still a good album, but not as good as the prior two. But yes, I mean, there is an insane amount, so much so that we've had to leave out some incredible records. You know, so we do, of course, have honorable mentions, but these are perhaps more honorable than they've ever been because they're all classic albums. So anybody that's in this list that doesn't even make it into the top 10, I think still deserves to be, you know, if you haven't listened to any of these, deserves to be listened to, deserves to be given that time, because they're all incredible, aren't they? You know?
Absolutely.
So yeah, we'll let you go into your honorable mentions, Lee. What are the ones that didn't quite make it this time around?
Jesus, at some point, the honorable mentions is longer than the top 10, mate. I mean, a lot of me, for me, there was a lot of albums growing up in my teenage years. I'm a kid of the early 2000s, you know. So there was a lot of albums in that period that were incredible, but maybe not be the best top third ever, which is why they kind of slipped into honorable mentions. Things like Deftones' White Pony and Green Day's Dookie and Limp Bizkit Chocolate Starfish and Hot Dog Flavour Water, Slipknot Volume 3, all albums I still go back to, but maybe not, you know, the pinnacle third albums for any of those bands in particular. And then, you know, I had albums like Rival Sons' Great Western Valkyrie, which is an incredible record. but it slipped out because I don't think it's their finest work. There's a band that continue to evolve and continue to progress, in my opinion. So
I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop you right there. People are going to say this in the comments, so I'm going to stop you right there.
It's their fourth record, isn't it?
It's their fourth album. So Head Down is the third record.
There you go. That's why I didn't make it in. It's not their.
Yeah. I know this because I literally checked about 2 hours ago. So I'll give you that.
Well, at least they didn't put it in the top 10. Eh?
Yeah.
I also forgot about their self-release that they did before. Pressure in Time, before Into the Fire, before the fire.
Yeah, everybody forgets about that one. That's what does it.
Yeah, there you go. So they didn't make it because it's not relevant.
Yeah, it's technically a fifth album. Well, yeah, it'd be a fourth album. So, but yes, other than that, carry on.
All right. And then I had Motorhead's Bomber in there. But again,
oh my god, yeah.
I don't think it's a classic album, but I don't think it's necessarily their finest. Certainly not a favorite. Not my favorite. It's a great record, but it's not what I feel is their pinnacle. And then one that kept diving in, kept coming out, kept coming back in again. And some people are going to scream at the screens right now for me for saying this, but it's Ozzy and Bark at the Moon. That was my last honorable mention.
Yeah. This is so ironic. So I'm going to open with my honorable mentions. So at the beginning of this episode, I cut in just me literally changing my number 10. And people will be thinking, who the hell has dropped out of the number 10 spot? And it is Ozzy with Bark at the Moon. It is the one that's just dropped into kind of the spiritual number 11. And, I just want to kind of touch on it a little bit because it is such a big kind of benchmark moment for Ozzy. And, there was this whole thing. I mean, for those out there that have just kind of jumped on board from the Carmine Appice interview at the time of this release, obviously Carmine came in after Tommy Aldridge left, and there was this whole debate of, maybe he did record on this record and didn't get fully credited. There is that belief. He says that that's what happened. But disregarding that, though, it's a classic record. But I just felt that he's done. But for me, I'm more of the No More Tears kind of guy. I am. What's the other one? Is it Wicked?
Wicked Game.
Something like that, isn't it? It is Wicked Game, isn't it? It's the first one with Zach Wilde on it. It's got like Miracle Man, all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit further down the road. I feel that, he just gets better, but I think, there's that whole turmoil around this record with Tommy Aldridge being sacked bizarrely. Yeah. And the kind of madness of Ozzy during his kind of drug years. It was a bit of a chaotic period, but other than that, it's a great record, but it just misses out for another one that I will mention in a bit. But my other honorable mentions are Iggy Pop and the Stooges with Raw Power. You've got Search and Destroy, Give Me Danger. I mean, these are like great songs. Just missed out. Humble Pie 3, just entitled 3. You've got stuff like Earth and Water Song, great stuff. A more recent one, The Raconteurs with Help a Stranger. I mean, I think that's just such an underrated record at this point. It's kind of, it was there and then it was gone. But I think it's a great album worth listening to. A surprise one, AC/DC, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. That is the third record, kind of just before they really kind of became the AC/DC I think we know today. I think very close, but not quite. Another one, Canned Heat, Living the Blues, another great stuff. You've got like Going Out the Country, some really iconic songs in there. The Doors, Waiting for the Sun, and then finally Halloween, Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 2, which of course has one of my favorite songs, I Want Out. Just such a great, cool song. All of those didn't make it, which is astonishing, really. But yes, we'll jump into our top 10. Who's the first one, Lee, that's made it into this top 10 that's like the hardest of top 10s to get into?
Well, like you say, mate, it's been very difficult to do this. Uh, I genuinely had about 28, 29 albums on my list when I was
Mm,
scribbling ideas down. So narrow it down to top 10 has been tricky. Um, and we often talk about small margins in like from six upwards when we've done other top tens. And I think my number 10 starts at a small margin between this and number one. It's Wishbone Ash and Argus.
ah, yes.
uh, which to me
Yeah.
is it's severely overlooked as an influential album. I mean, the twin guitar work on the album um, is absolutely pinnacle. I know throughout the record, but it's then set to influence the likes of Thin Lizzy and Judas
Mm,
Priest and Iron Maiden, which is self impressive. And we're seeing an interview with Steve Harris when he said, if anybody wants to understand what we were doing in the early days of Iron Maiden, just listen to Argus.
mm,
It came out in 1972, and if you go on Spotify, 4 out of 5 of their top tracks are from this album. Um, with the likes of The King Will Come, Blowing Free, Sometime World, Leaf and Stream. Uh, Without doubt, for me, one of the most pinnacle, more progressive side of things I enjoy, and
mm,
one that's often overlooked. I mean, it came out just over a year before Dark Side of the Moon came out, and
mm,
whilst that Dark Side of the Moon became a very iconic record, I'd still argue that stylistically and in terms of songwriting and the songs on it, that Argus just goes toe to toe with it. And yeah, for that reason, it's my number 10.
My number 10, I'm going to change it a little bit again. The one that I've just thrown in, replacing Bark of the Moon's moved up another space. Um, literally during that conversation. So my number 10 currently is, it might change, is Soundgarden with Bad Motorfinger. Clue with my shirt here. I do have
No,
the little clue there. Of course, that came out in '91. And I feel that it blended. It was that bridge. I think you had your Nirvana's come out with kind of pure grunge. Whereas I think Soundgarden. You got Chris Cornell, who's got this great rock voice.
great voice.
And it's just kind of this blend between grunge and rock. It's like the bridge. Maybe for those that were really into rock that couldn't quite get into grunge, I think that's kind of your gateway. Um, and this is the one I feel that really elevated them forward. You got stuff like Rusty Cage, Outshined, and then there's this controversial video that came out at the time, Jesus Christ Pose, which got them banned from MTV for those religious bits of imagery there at the time. How times changed. But it feels like this is kind of the beginning of that golden era. After that they would go on and have Super Unknown, which is it takes them to another level, right? And this feels like the beginning of that. So I feel that it's dropped one space during this conversation, but I think it does deserve to be in this top 10. I mean, particularly Chris Cornell, his writing, his voice, it's great stuff, right?
And it's a fantastic record, fantastic. Yeah, so my number 9, I spoke about the band's debut for the second album for Music for the Jilted Generation, so I've kind of given the band away now. Uh, this time around, I could mention the third, and it's the Prodigy with Fat of the Land.
Right.
I mean, just the singles alone, Breathe, Firestarter, Smack My Bitch Up. These are all absolute Prodigy classics. But then you got deeper cuts like Thriller and Minefields and Funky Shit and Diesel Power. They still cut it live. I was 10 years old when the album came out in 97. And I remember seeing the video for Breathe come on to Top of the Pops, and it just like blew my head. I wasn't really into Top of the Pops. My dad was very much, recording John Peel and giving me that to listen to. That's what I was sort of aiming for. But all the kids at school watched the Top Pops, and I was 10, so I used to watch it. And every now and then, a lightning bolt would come out of it, and amongst
Mm,
the kind of bourgeois of Backstreet Boys and Spice Girls and all that kind of mainstream pop. And in the middle of all that, you've got Keith Flint in Black and White going mental. Uh,
mm,
Maxim and the rest of the boys. and it just kicked it out of the park. And arguably those songs are still a pinnacle of the Prodigy live, and that whole thing came everywhere. I mean, I remember getting parodied by like Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer on Shooting Stars. You know, it really became a part of like British culture in a way to kind of thingy it. You know, and you know, if you're getting parody, you've made a point. You know, people are aware enough of it that it's a topical enough subject to take the mick out of, that people are going to understand what you're taking the mick out of. You know?
Mm.
I mean, Gene Simmons covered Firestarter on his solo album.
Wow.
So, you know,
It's a
if you
bit of
get,
trivia.
yeah, you know, you get someone like Gene Simmons covering The Prodigy, you know, it's had an impact because let's face it, Gene doesn't do stuff if it's not going to make him any money.
No.
Which is fair enough. He's a businessman, you know. Um, and yeah, man, like I remember like everyone from like kids my age who were just enjoying the kind of manicness of this dance music with this punk rock kind of sensibility to it. All the way through to the rave scene, to punks, to rockers. It just sort of encompassed everything. And it's still an album that was so far out on its own that I think you could put it on now and it wouldn't sound like it, you know, 26 years old.
Yes. My number nine, the one that's kind of crept in at the death, the one that people will be wondering, how has this toppled Ozzy's Bark at the Moon and pushed Soundgarden down? It's Nirvana with In Utero.
Cool.
It obviously came out in '93. You know, it's is it celebrating its 30th anniversary this year?
I think
Yeah, I believe it's this year. And you know, it's got the classics like Heart Shaped Box in there. You know, it's obviously the third and final album. And I feel that this is peak Nirvana, and that was the thing for me. Like you know, with regarding Ozzy, it wasn't peak Ozzy, was it? It was, you know, it was great. The single in particular for Bark at the Moon was great, but it start to finish, it lacks that extra something. And I feel that In Utero is you know the peak Nirvana. You know, the production's better, everything's better. Um, you know, for me, I feel it's kind of, you know, everybody always cites Nevermind as the big one, but I don't know. I feel that this is the most complete Nirvana album. I don't know about your thoughts on that, but
yeah, it's always been my favorite Nirvana album, to be fair, mate. I'm with you. I think Nevermind was obviously, you know, the commercial peak for them. That's fair.
mm,
And it's obviously always been the more iconic one in terms of, you know, visual and cover art, and the one that everyone always cites. And it's no doubt that, you know, Nevermind is a brilliant record,
mm,
backed by some big singles. Obviously, it Smells Like Teen Spirit on it and all of that. But I always thought that In Utero was just, it might not actually have the same impact commercially in
mm,
terms of like, you know, everybody always thinks Nirvana, they think Smells Like Teen Spirit, but like say tracks like Heart Shaped Box and everything else that's on that record, I just think it's in my opinion, like you say, it's a more complete, it's a more rounded, it's a more
mm.
in-depth Nirvana experience than Nevermind might be.
Yeah, you know, I think that you know it's obviously a little bit tainted with it being the final one kind of abruptly. Um, but I just think that, you know, this is kind of Kurt, his writing at this point is kind of on another level. And I think the band, you know, having been touring together for that long period of time as well, there's a real chemistry between the three. You know, maybe it's that intense touring. Um, but there was something special with that one. And I felt that I felt it needed to be in that number 10. And, you know, it just crept up that one little step more based on, you know, like Soundgarden, their pinnacle, you could argue, is Super Unknown. I would say that Nirvana's is In Utero. So that for me is the reason why it is my number nine. Um, your number eight.
Yeah, so my number eight, are a band I've recently been delving back into the last couple of years, uh, having the band reformed in 2018. A band that I often think gets very overlooked, but if, like me, you're a fan of the more progressive side of things at times,
Mm,
it's a band that you'll like, and it's the band's Pure Reason Revolution, and it's their Hammer and Anvil album. They've got an incredible new album actually coming out in a couple of weeks' time. But with this record, to me, it's the modern day kind of progressive flagship kind of record. It was a real departure from the first two albums that the guys have made. It still retained all these kind of, they're a modern prog band. They're not sounding like, we had Wishbone Ash, for example, earlier on. They don't sound like that. They are very much an amalgamation of all their influences, one of which being grunge. And it still had these really big, hooky grunge sounds, but they massively sort of encompassed all these electronic trance elements and loops and stuff. There's no album that sounds like it, in my opinion. And rediscovering the guys since their reformation in 2018, it just becomes more apparent to me that there's still no one that sounds like this. And even the new album that they've created doesn't sound like this. The typical progressive act, they make a point and then they try something different and move on and move forward and encompass something else or go down a different route. But again, so far out on its own that it doesn't sound 14 years old. And if anybody's listening and watching that hasn't heard the album and likes the more progressive side of things, then I'd urge them to check this album out, especially Black Morning and Over the Top in particular. So yeah, that is my number 8.
My number 8, it's one that we kind of briefly touched on in the previous one because there was a huge blunder from Lee Graham about Black Sabbath and Paranoid. This do go and check that out if you haven't. It's class. This time though, it's Black Sabbath with Master of Reality. It came out in 1971. In after your Paranoid and after that incredible debut album, it is kind of more of what Sabbath do well. But I think that this is a fantastic continuation. You look at, for me, my personal highlight, Children of the Grave. I mean, that for me is kind of what elevates it that little bit higher. Some real classic stuff in there, opening the record with like Sweet Relief, which is just a bizarre way of starting an album with somebody coughing. Would that happen today? I don't know. There's something about it. And then obviously you got that different shade, you got stuff like Solitude, which is just that different flavor from them. But I feel that, Sabbath, particularly for the first kind of 4 or 5 records, they were just smashing it out of the park. And this is they're at that third album now, and they've continued that momentum, I think, and they're not necessarily reinventing the wheel at this point, but there's certainly no drop off either. And when we had that kind of initial thought of third albums, we were thinking about, will there be a drop off with some of these bands? Sabbath's definitely not the case.
These first 4, 5, possibly even 6 albums with Sabbath, all the way up. I mean, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath is a pinnacle for me. I just adore that record. But yeah, all the way through, it's just slamming. It's like it's not like an album where you go, and despite what they were chucking up their noses and into their system and pouring whatever down their throat, and they're still coming up with this insanely good music. That is just knocking everyone else out of the arena, so to speak. No one else is getting to touch them, and they're still doing that. It's an incredible.
Yeah, and I feel that they needed to be included because, I mean, number one, it's another great album, but also the level of consistency. In a short space of just a few years, you've released the debut, which is self-titled Black Sabbath. You've then followed it up with Paranoid less than a year later, and then I believe it'd be the year after that. You've then gone with Master of Reality. I mean, that's in a short space of time. You released 3 records, and they're all classics. They're all ones that stand up today, and that's just such an impressive thing to do. I mean, you don't see that kind of release schedule happen these days. It's much more spread out. So to be able to carry on the gold for into a third album and having just released two others is quite incredible. Yes, you're number 7.
Yeah, my number 7. We spoke earlier about junior honorable mentions. I was talking about albums from my teenage years, and this is one from there, but one I very much continue to return to again and again, and it's Queens of the Stone Age with Songs for the Deaf.
Mm.
I mean, yes, I mean, just look at the singles alone. I mean, First Together, Go with the Flow, of course, No One Knows, which is an absolute. But album tracks like You Think I'm Worth a Dollar, but I Feel Like a Millionaire, or Six Shooter, or God Is on the Radio, or Song for the Dead itself, the whole album is storming, and 22 years later, it still sounds strong as hell. Obviously, Dave Grohl came along and played drums on that record. I don't know if any of yourself or anyone's watching and seen the Back and Forth Foo Fighters documentary that came about. But on that, they talk about this period where, Dave Grohl was recording drums for Queens of the Stone Age, and there was a lot of internal fighting, as they put it themselves. At the time in the Foos records, there was frustration when they were recording the One by One album. It wasn't how they wanted it to, and they were all getting annoyed with each other because of that. Dave Grohl went, "Stop this! I'm going to go off and do Queens of the Stone Age," and they both were playing Coachella Festival, and the Foos had agreed that would be the Foos' last show.
Wow.
They hadn't announced it, but apparently they had a bit of a bust up backstage, and they went, "Right, this is it. We go do that," and then that's all we do. And then Taylor Hawkins went to go watch Queens of the Stone Age with Dave Grohl behind the kit. And on the documentary, Taylor's like, "Oh, I then just, we said goodbye to the Foos. I was just watching my friend play drums at this point. I wasn't watching my singer go off and play drums with another band. I was just watching my friend play drums, and it was obvious the way he was playing that he really enjoyed doing it, and really clearly meant a lot to him." He said that me and Big Dave had a heart to heart, and then we went and did this food show, and because it was a mixture of like forgiveness and still being a bit pissed off, basically, the food show for Coachella went immense. And then they decided, oh, okay, well, let's just go off and do it. And if you watch the documentary, they basically had run out of money pretty much from the record label to do One by One. So they then went to Dave Grohl's home studio, and that is the album version that went out to. So indirectly or directly, there is a link between these two phenomenal records. And I'd argue that Queen of Stone Age have written some great albums since, but I'd argue that this is at their
It's the
absolute
pinnacle, isn't it?
their absolute peak. You know what I mean? And I just find it, still to this day, you go watch the Queens of the Stone Age, and I love the last record, by the way, in Times New Roman. It was a great record, and Villains before that was also incredible. But there's something about when they play No One Knows live. It's just like it's their anthem, you know what I mean? It's like going to go watch Queen and hearing them do Bo Rap, or Soundgarden you mentioned earlier, and hear them do, I don't know, Jesus Christ Pose, or Black Hole Sun or something. It's just one of those anthems. And it still stands the test of time. It's one of the ones from my teenage years that I still regularly go back to, and not from a nostalgia point of view, just this is still a good album. I'm not listening it to remember parties and being 14 and not having any cares in the world or whatever. Yeah, I'm listening to it because I want to hear First to Give, if I want to hear No One Knows, or I want to hear, I just want to hear the album. That reason's my number 7.
My number 7. It's a band that, and this album in particular, has influenced so many other bands and musicians that I feel that it has to be in here. It's Free with Fire and Water. Came out in 1970. Obviously has that iconic track All Right Now. And I just think that, this is kind of prime Paul Rodgers. A lot of people say, oh, Bad Company. But, a lot of people, you're either Free or you're Bad Company, aren't you? I think a lot of people, you fall into those two categories. And, I've always edged more towards Free. I just think that there's something about that era in which I feel is kind of peak Paul Rodgers. And particularly when you look at this kind of retro scene that's come back round again today, you're seeing a lot of people say all free, and Fire and Water in particular. If I ask any of the guys from Silver Roller,
I was just going to mention
I am sure that this album will come up at some point. For those that aren't familiar with Silver Roller, go and check them out. But yes, I think that this is kind of a peak Paul Rogers in my view. It's good classic rock done well, not overproduced. It's done in this fantastic way, and it's stood the test of time. And it's come out during a period in which there was this boom of bands releasing great stuff. You've got your Led Zeppelins and whatnot. And these guys were right up there, and it's always kind of like I like Bad Company, but I've always kind of hoped that we'd have had a bit more from Free. I don't know, there's something about that era that I really love. But yes, that is my number 7. I think that it has to be in there due to the legacy of this record in particular. I think that it's peak Free, it's peak Paul Rogers, and you could certainly argue peak Influence. The lineage that it's had is quite something else. So yes, that is my number 7.
Yeah, my number 6 is an album you mentioned earlier, and it's an album that's on your t-shirt.
It's going high.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
Motorfinger, man. It's just, for me, it's with you, as you mentioned, people could say that's super unknown because of the hits like Black Hole Sun on it. Would have been, the top pinnacle album. But for me, with Bad Motorfinger, I mean, Slaves and Bulldozers, Face Pollution, Rusty Cage, Outshined, Room with 1,000 Years Wide, Jesus Christ Proposed. You can't argue with these songs. It's it's a phenomenal record. And like you say, they had all the controversy around Jesus Christ Pose in the video. And they literally were receiving death threats by weird people. Too far by using, Jesus Christ imagery and stuff. And for me, it's going to sound like a snotty teenage move, but when a band has that much of an impact, that people are getting that offended by an album, and it's not like it's Cradle of Filth teacher of Jesus, Jesus is written on it.
Yeah.
Like that. It's not something that is just done for shock factor. It's just an imagery. Chris Cornell himself said in interviews, the Jesus Christ pose was literally written about the 80s rock stars who went on stage like that. That is what it is. And yet they've taken that too far to the point of sending them death threats over a song and a video. And you're like, you're making that much of an impact and having that much statement. I think it just shows how strong the message was in a track, even if you didn't put it there. That's not the message you gave out, but someone felt something enough, even if they took it in completely the wrong direction, it still empowered those who hated you or hated what they perceived to be your message, even if it wasn't. It still evoked enough emotion in them, and whether that emotion was justified, which it wasn't, or not, it's still evoking something in someone who doesn't want to be evoked. And when you evoke emotion in someone who isn't a fan, and yes, they might have taken the wrong message of it, but it still had an impact on them in that way. I think it shows how powerful a record it is. And it's just incredible. I mean, I remember my dad playing this album when it came out, and I was just immediately like, "What is this?" I'd heard Soundgarden before. My dad was very much into the grunge era when it came out. The house full of Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and Mudhoney and Stone Temple Pilots and Nirvana, obviously, and everything else that came with it. But that was an album where I was like, "What is this? Like, I need to soak this up. I want to immerse myself in this." And like you say, Chris Cornell's voice on this album in particular, so strong. And it's the first time they did with Ben Shepherd on bass, who I thought brought another dimension to it from Justin Everman, who he took over from Jason Everman, sorry. it was the first album that Ben was on, and I just think it was what an album to play on for your first record. The
Mm,
first record you do with a band, and it's Bad Motorfinger. I mean, this is one of we've spoken about the vinyl policy before, where like
mm.
it's like my top albums. I don't have a huge vinyl collection. I'm slowly building on it, but Bad Motorfinger was one of the first albums I went and got.
Mm.
Had to have that on vinyl. And it's just an incredible record. And yeah, it's just people don't make that much controversy over a mediocre record, basically, as well. I was trying to say.
Yeah, I mean the just to have that level of reach where you're essentially breaking out of the rock sphere or the grunge sphere or whatever sphere, to cross over into what I was classed as the mainstream, like and be banned by MTV. But I mean, all publicity is good publicity, right? But I think that they offered something different for that era, particularly at this point. A lot, they were doing something that a lot of people after Nirvana went down we're basically going to be a Nirvana band, we're going to sound like Nirvana, we're going to look like Nirvana, and a lot of blonde-haired guitarists turning up, left-handed, playing Jaguars. But it's one of them. Like they kind of do their own thing. Cornell was his own man. He does his own thing, and yeah, it's an iconic album, isn't it? It's too big to ignore.
No one plays guitar like Kim to Hill either. You know what I mean? No one plays
Mm,
Hill. He doesn't play. They say you talk about the Nirvana side of things with the grunge movement, and Nirvana very chord based, very sort of almost
yeah.
pop sensibility about it, even though it was sort of the antithesis of pop, obviously.
Mm,
Uh, Kim to Hill is not playing chords.
no.
I mean, and I just think both musicianship and vocally and songwriting wise on this album, I just think it's stunning. So yeah,
Yes, my number six, we've already moved into, I mean, we're kind of already right in the midst of legendary, but we're going to go into a really huge legendary band. It's Led Zeppelin with Led Zeppelin 3. Bizarrely released on what some would say is the greatest day ever, October the 5th, which is my birthday, 1970. Full of classics there. The Immigrant Song, I've always loved Friends, Gallows Pole, Since Been Loving You. And they've incorporated this time around that kind of more acoustic flavor into a lot of their songs. And I think that when you get to a third album, you could make the mistake of doing more of what's successful. But to have that balance of, they've still kind of followed down that road. It's further down that line, but they didn't pivot and go completely haywire. But they also brought in something new, something fresh into that mix. And it's the next evolution of Led Zeppelin again. It's like it's the progression, isn't it? And it obviously before that mammoth album of Led Zeppelin 4, it has that promise of what they're going to go and be next, isn't it?
oh yeah,
It's kind of looking back, you can see where it's going. Particularly with stuff like the Immigrant Song, that's really like it's so close to a Led Zeppelin 4 kind of vibe. But yes, I feel that it has to be in this top 10 again, very much like Sabbath, where it's just a consistent classic album run that they went on in a short space of time. And to be able to keep that consistency and keep churning out these classic albums, it's unprecedented. You just don't see it nowadays. So I think that it has to be kind of almost pointed out a little bit.
even like Breon Stomp and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
More album cuts. I mean, you can't deny Immigrant Song and Celebration Day and Friends, and Gallows Pole. Forgot that was on there.
Yeah.
Great record. It's another one that's made my vinyl cut. So
Hmm. I think it's like the ugly child a little bit. You've got like two and Led Zepp 4 that it's right in between those two, which are kind of, for a lot of people, they're the favorites. But I feel that this is kind of not as far as overlooked, but kind of maybe in their catalog it's a little bit overlooked. It's ridiculous that it kind of is a little bit, but it's so many classics. Obviously outside of Immigrant Song.
yeah.
I think a lot of people just kind of look to that one, but there's much more in there. Yes, you're on number 5.
Oh, yeah, my number 5. For me, another modern-ish day classic. And to be honest, with the next 4 choices, any of them could be a number 1 at any given day. I'm very much up to that point now. And it's Tool with Lateralis.
Ooh.
Now, Tool are no doubt a dividing band. They're a Marmite band. You either love them or you don't. You either get them or you don't. Some of those would regard to Lateralis, myself included in this one, as the band's pinnacle album to date. 23 years later, somehow. It's beyond its time, so much so that, a lot of, I went to see him a couple of months ago up in Manchester, and they played the title track, and everyone went mental. They're just like the thing, and they're very much focusing on the now. So they were very much a Fear Inoculum, their latest album, heavy set. And they play anything from this. They play The Grudge. I mean, The Grudge is an opening track, and without doubt, I think a lot of Tool fans would agree that's not a single, but they're not really a band that does singles. They're more bands that do whole albums. And although Grudge wasn't released as an official single, I think most fans would say that it's a top song for them, and it opens the record. Which, when you're opening, it's similar to what we're saying about Zeppelin 3 opening Immigrant Song. When you open with something that's strong, it's insane. And then it leads you all the way through with tracks like The Patient and Schism and Ticks and Fleas and the title track itself. I mean, the power on this track is the albums are relentless. It kicks you in the face with The Grudge. I mean, the riff on The Grudge is just dirty. It just smacks you in the face, and it doesn't relent. And that power doesn't dwindle on their album. So now they're a band that continually write albums that continue to reveal themselves to you. And they're quite, I think it's fair to say they're quite sporadic in releasing albums, and they release them when they feel it's right. They're not kind of contrived by this releasing an album every 2 to 3 years necessarily. Between Fear Inoculum and 10,000 Days, the one before the most recent record was like 13 years, which as a fan is frustrating because you're like, we want more music. But equally, when Fear Inoculum came out, it worked, and when you kind of forget, it kind of dissipates when it's worth it. But equally with Lateralis, it's just another album I just go back to time and time again. And yes, they've wrote albums since that have been killer, but this is an album that's like a pinnacle. And the songwriting on this is ridiculous. Yes, you have to soak it up like a lot of progressive albums. They don't have pop hits or popular hits, for want of a better term. But what they do have is albums that are solid, that keep revealing themselves today. And this, for me, is a defining moment for a band who are so far out on their own, sonically, visually, the whole thing musically. There's not another band like Tool. There just isn't.
I'm going to be jumping back into the past again. I'm going with Cream, Wheels of Fire for my number 5. Came out in 1968. Obviously, such a benchmark album. That opens with that classic song White Room. It's such an iconic song, iconic cover, just everything about it. And kind of in spite of all of the trouble that was going on, the band obviously famously hated each other. It's they didn't get on at all, but seemingly managed to put these differences aside. I mean, when you listen to the record, you'd be quite if you didn't know that, you'd be quite surprised. But bizarrely at the time, this was not a well-received album, believe it or not.
Really?
Yes, famously, Rolling Stone magazine released. I can't remember the person that did it, but that wrote the article. But they basically said that it was kind of uh, middle of the road. They felt that they could do better. They felt that it lacked variety. They were like, oh, it's kind of more of the same. It's not. Yeah, it was a very mundane review. And interestingly, now, if anybody has out there, if anybody has an original copy of that release of Rolling Stone, you're kind of one of the few that owns it because it's been buried. You can't find it online. You can't find anything. They have quietly hidden it away and destroyed it. because this I can't remember the dude's name, but this guy came out and he just slated this record, and obviously it's now considered one of the most iconic albums around. I mean, it's such a big thing. I mean, apparently Eric Clapton read the article, and he just kind of like had this panic about it. He was kind of really concerned about where they were going. And it's like, obviously now you look back and it's kind of one of those go-to things. I mean, how many times have you heard White Room?
Well, yeah.
It's in movies, it's everywhere. It's in pop culture at this point.
Well, Apocalyptic did that cover of it, didn't they? With Jacoby and Papa Roach.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's been covered loads of times. It's in loads of movies. I mean, only a couple of years ago, it was in the Joker movie. It's in pop culture at this point. But I feel that this album is so influential. You look at who it's gone on to influence, some really iconic bands. And it's that group. It's a super group. They're all incredible. You got Ginger Baker as well there, and it's an iconic album of an iconic band. I feel that it's, in my opinion, I think it's Cream's peak. It's my personal favorite one from them, and with that and the influence that it's gone on to have, I feel that it has to be in that kind of top 5. So that's why it's there. That's my number 5. You're moving into top 4. It's I mean, Lord knows who's going to be in this top 4.
Who I forgot.
Don't you write it down?
I've got it written down, but I didn't write down Black Sabbath Paranoid.
No, that's true.
My number 4 is stylistically completely different from everything else that I've kind of put on this list. It was an album you were talking about, yours moving through. Just before we started recording, this one came into me last minute. This one came to me this morning.
Wow, last minute.
When I realized that it was their 3rd album, and for me, it's one of the greatest albums ever. It's one of the most UK's biggest selling albums of all time, and it's the Verve with Urban Hymns.
Right.
So much more down that kind of Brit rock, Brit pop route.
Yeah.
The 90s. I grew up, and again, similarly to other albums we mentioned, it was 97, so I was like 10 when this record came out. Similarly to I was a weird kid. I was listening to Prodigy and the Verve.
It's an interesting mix.
Yeah, but again, why not?
There's no rules. Who cares, right?
There's no rules when you're 10, is there? You can do what other people listen to Tweenies and Backstreet Boys, so I don't think Prodigy is too far apart. But first single on this Bittersweet Symphony, arguably the biggest hit band ever had. It was developed from a sample of the Stones track Last Time, but it was done by an orchestration. It was sampled from an orchestra that had done it, and then they added like vocals and strings and stuff and built up to Bittersweet Symphony. And although they obtained the rights to use the sample, they were denied permission by the Rolling Stones former manager. I think his name's Alan Klein. And basically, the Stones and Klein got all of the money from the first single after he denied it, even though it was not the Stones that had been sampled. It was their music, of course. It was their intellectual property, but it was an orchestrated version that had been used. And they were denied it. Biggest single they ever had, and they were denied. That got revoked. I think it wasn't that long ago. I want to say it was like 2018, 2019. I could be wrong, but I don't. Basically, the former Stones manager died, and then the son, it might have been a daughter, but the child who took over his estate essentially then kind of revoked it back, and the Stones agreed and gave the rights back to Richard Ashcroft of Verve, who wrote it. And again, I mean, that album, that iconic video for Beat Street Symphony of Richard Ashcroft just walking down the road, bumping into everyone who was in his path. And it was just and it was that thing. It was the same thing when I saw Prodigy Breathe. It was just one of those things, the video, I was just like, I want to do that. Why am I running in and out of people as a kid? I want to go and do this. And it was such an album. I mean, again, something that's been parodied time and time again. The album itself, we can talk about Bits of Symphony all the way home, but tracks like Sonnet and Drugs Don't Work and Catching the Butterfly and Lucky Man, I mean, it's a huge, huge album. It's an album where those music gets used in countless films, countless TV shows. I wore out 2 cassette copies of this record, just listening to it over and over again as a kid in my Walkman on my way to school. And I don't think there was a kid in my year at school who didn't walk down the street and try and imitate Richard Ashcroft, who didn't go and wear a big parka and think they were part of the whole Britpop thing. And Wonderwall by Oasis will probably be always deemed to be the pinnacle Oasis and probably the most iconic record of the Britpop thing. But I would argue that Urban Hymns is a better record. I love Oasis, but I do think Urban Hymns is just, there's one of those things where the stars aligned, the stars aligned for it, and so much so that Richard Ashcroft, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, he released an album called Acoustic Hymns, which was a reworkings of all the tracks on Urban Hymns. It wasn't necessarily all acoustic, but it was broken down. It was more beat up. Some of it went more bluesgrassy. Some of it went very different directions. And it was incredible. And, 10, 11 years after the album came out, I got to see Verve at the UEA when I was studying there. And it was incredible. And seeing these, and it was just amazing. They did the 10th anniversary tour. They came out and it was fantastic. And my inner 10-year-old was very, very happy. As I think most guys in the audience, the similar age to me were. And it's just again, it's an album that over the years, periodically, I pick back up and I think, oh shit, I've not listened to that for ages. And it's like I don't know, it's one of those albums you just keep going back to and you kind of get to rediscover all over it. And I've done that for the last, since I was 10, so last 25 years, 26 years. For that reason, it's my number 4.
My number 4. It's a band that's been cited as kind of a massive influence on Iron Maiden. It's UFO with Phenomena. Came out in 1974. Obviously has some massive tracks on it, like Doctor Doctor, which many people, if you've ever been to an Iron Maiden gig, you might find that comes on before they come out. You've got other great stuff on there like Space Child and Rock Bottom. I think that, I mean, it's the more you listen to it, the more like you hear these guitar parts that are like, this is very Maiden before Maiden, and it's they, I don't know, they've almost become an underrated band nowadays. It's really strange. There's such a great band, and I think that many will argue, this is perhaps their strongest studio album. But I think that there's something about UFO and the influence that they've had and the career they've had. I mean, I think that, with time it came out around again, all of these golden bands, this golden era. You've had your Sabbaths and your Led Zeppelins and such, and UFO were right in there in the mix at the time. And huge influence that they've had, and this record in particular is the one, we speak about, ones to own on vinyl, and I would say UFO Phenomenon is going to be one of those. It's just an iconic album. If you look at ones that changed the game, I think that this is certainly one of those that certainly did that. Something special about it. It just has a feeling about it. From the minute that you put it on, you feel like, oh, this has changed everything now. It's one of them. But it seems to, the whole band seemed to have been kind of forgotten a bit in time.
This was the era when Michael Schenker was still playing for them as well, wasn't it?
I believe so, yeah, 1974.
Yeah, probably would have been then, I guess.
Yeah. It's just like, it's peak UFO. It's one of, as I say, it's bizarre that you don't see it mentioned as much these days. Yet, if you speak to a musician, particularly if they were growing up in this era, so many will say about this. I mean, it's very much, it's a similar conversation to what we had about with Free. It's a similar thing. It's a musician's band. It's that kind of thing. And I feel it has to be in that top four due to the level of influence. And it's a great album for those that are perhaps a bit younger that haven't heard Phenomenon. Go and listen to it. It sounds great. It's got these kind of it's bizarre to say. It's got these Iron Maidenisms before Maiden. They were doing it before Iron Maiden, and it's worth listening to. Go and check it out. Great album, iconic album. It has to be in the top four. So it is. It's in mine.
Let's come into bed while we talk about UFO. Michael Schenker has just done an album of UFO classics.
And I bet you bottom dollar that there'll be some of those that are off Phenomenon.
I would guarantee. I mean, Doctor's on, isn't it? I think
it's a quintessential one. So you got Doctor, you got a Space Child, you got Rock Bottom. All of these kind of big UFO songs, the ones that they would kind of end their show with, is on this album, and it's for me, it's peak UFOs. Maybe some may argue that. But I think that it's certainly the most influential record.
I think I'm right in saying that on the version of Doctor, because I did get it sent to me for the radio show. I think it's Slash that's playing guitar on it. The list of co-musicians. He's got Axl Rose appearing on something else. Got some great musicians on this, Michael Schenker. And he just said he wanted to, celebrate that period of his life. Schenker to do his own solo stuff and everything else, but that UFO period he obviously looks at with a lot of positive thought and a lot of good memories. We do it. So the rendition of Doctor I did here was awesome, and I'm sure it's Slash on that one in particular. But
it's an iconic record. Your number three, top three.
Yeah, top three. You talk about iconic records there, and I would argue that the next three are all iconic records as well. Going back a little bit further, and I have somewhere down the list previous albums I mentioned. This album, again, you're talking about rock classics. I'd argue that I reckon 90% of the people watching this or listening to it have this album in their collection, whether they bought it or not, whether they want to admit to buying it or not, whether they even want to know or even remember how it appeared in their collection. I guarantee most people have got it, and it's Bon Jovi and Slippery When Wet.
Oh yes, it's an iconic album.
It is, I mean, we could obviously talk about Living on a Prayer.
It's been played to death, but
let's be honest. But it's the deep album cuts on here. I like tracks like Social Disease and Let It Rock and Wild in the Streets, and I Die for You and Raise Your Hands. I mean, but equally, you can't ignore the singles on this album. You know what I mean?
Mm.
You Give Love a Bad Name and Wanted Dead or Alive, or Never Say Goodbye, and of course, Living on a Prayer. Um, I think it's fair to say that you could walk into any bar in any town
Mm.
Friday or Saturday night, and if there's a covers band on, I guarantee you at some point in the night they'll either play Living on a Prayer, You Gave Love a Bad Name, or Wanted Dead or Alive. I
Yeah.
guarantee it. Um, and as much as I don't like to say it, it's that moment when you're at a wedding or something like that, and you walk past the DJ and it's just generic wedding music, and you get the DJ going, got some rock for you later, mate.
Yes, it will inevitably be. I get that. It's the I've got long hair, and he goes, "This is the one for you, son." And it's
Yes,
it's
exactly
not
that.
joking.
And you know full well it's gonna, and then you just hear that bass line, you're like, "Oh, he's doing living
Yeah.
on." And we've all, it's like any good song, it's been overplayed, not too much.
Mm.
But equally, it's an anthem. And if you're at that wedding and you've had enough beer in your system and you're just enjoying it, and then in the moment you'll do the woes like everyone else does, and you'll have a laugh.
Mm.
But the album as an album is incredible. It's arguably Bon Jovi's most defining record.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
I think again, when I was looking at Spotify things for this, 3 out of the 5 of their top 5 was from Slippery When Wet.
Mm.
It came out in 1986. So it's 38 years old. Um, and it's an incredible record. It really is. I mean, yes, Living on a Prayer has been played way too much, in my opinion, but that's the
Mm.
sign of any song. I mean, you'd say that about any big song.
Yeah.
Any big song has been played to the max.
I
But it's
mean, I look at this as we had this conversation about Leonard Skinner with their first album, debut albums. Uh, you know, how many times has Freebird been played? We had
exactly
the
it.
same conversation with the second one, with Skinner's second album, with Sweet Home Alabama. I
Yeah.
mean, and I think that when you have a single that's so big that it just kind of it breaks into the mainstream. It's played everywhere. Everybody knows it from the minute it comes on. It just shows how big of a damn record it is. And you can't deny that it is. It's a huge album. And, I imagine when that thing first came out, it was just everywhere. Um, it's one of those kind of game-changing albums. Whether I know there's some people out there that absolutely hate Bon Jovi these days, but that one in particular is a game changer.
Yeah, it is.
Mm.
Absolutely. I mean, I was reading the thing once, and the Social Disease, which on the album, which is one of the album cuts, really, but I absolutely love it. But that in its embryonic stage, if you like, before the
Mm.
band really grabbed hold of it, and it was just this sort of raw idea. The raw idea was done by record producer Desmond Child, who worked with loads of big acts in the 80s. And basically Aerosmith were fighting Bon Jovi for Social Disease. They
Mm.
saw something in it and they wanted it too. And it was with Bon Jovi. Well, Desmond was working with them on Slippery When Wet. And you're just like, I mean, even the album cover, I mean, that album cover was so iconic. And yet it was done at the 11th hour on a bin liner, basically. Um, because the initial Slippery When Wet album cover they wanted, which was basically, a sort of 80s stripper girl with a Bon Jovi
Mm.
wet t-shirt on, with obviously being soaked in water. They kind of went, Walmart won't stock that. You can't have
Mm.
an album cover. And I sort of seen view interviews with John Bon Jovi himself, and he's just like, we can't have the cover we want. We don't really care. So they literally just got like a bin liner, sprayed it with water, and John Bon Jovi literally just took his finger and wrote "Slippery When Wet." Click, done. And it's a throwaway thing that's become such an iconic image. Um, the irony is, I think I'm pretty right. I think I'm right in saying the image they wanted to use, they just used on the inside sleeve. But there we go.
Mm.
You could turn it around and have the proper cover if you wish. Uh, but it's just one of those albums, man. I'd argue most people, whether they like Bon Jovi or not, somewhere in their house they'll find this record,
Yeah.
and it's so iconic. The singles, the album cuts, the influence it had on the rest of the, for want of a better term, kind of hair metal genre of the 80s.
Mm.
It impacted so many bands. I saw Bon Jovi with my dad in Wembley, which would have been 24 years after this album came out. And arguably the songs on from, Slippery When Wet, I saw them the Crush era tour. And, arguably, other than the Crush album, which they were promoting, a lot of their set came from this kind of period, and specifically this album. The songs that people want to hear from them live. For that reason, it's my number three.
Mm. My number three. I'm not usually a fan of concept albums, but this is one of the exceptions. And I think that many would argue that this is maybe the greatest concept album. It's Queensryche with Operation Mindcrime. Obviously Jeff Tate, that was the one that he's come in for. That's kind of introduced, they exploded after this album came out. You've got these incredible hit singles. I Don't Believe in Love. I mean, Eyes of a Stranger. But I'm not usually a concept album guy, but this is the one. This is the one in my collection where this it's the exception to the rule, because I think it's just done so well that you cannot deny that it's just such a great record, and you can get really into it. And as I say, I'm not a guy for concept stuff. I've never really resonated with that kind of thing. But, this came out in 1988. And I just think that, towards that tail end of the 80s there, it's, throwing that out and again, it feels like a game changer moment. They were being touted as kind of the next big, huge mammoth band that were going to be around for many a year. Of course, that didn't quite happen, but this turning out to be arguably their pinnacle. I think disregarding that, though, it's such an iconic album now. If you say Queensryche to anybody that's familiar with them, this will be the one that people mention. Operation Mindcrime. It's the biggest one for them, and it's still there now, isn't it? Jeff Tate last year, I think he did his kind of tour in celebration of Operation Mindcrime. It's when you do these kind of anniversary things, it just shows how massive this record is, isn't it? There's still this hunger to hear those songs now. So yeah, that is that.
I remember going to see them. They did a 20th anniversary tour when I was at uni, so like 2008, and they did Operation Mindcrime 1 and 2, back to back. It was incredible, and I'm not going to sit here and say I'm the biggest, I'm the biggest fan, because I'm not. I like them. I like Queensryche. They're a good band, but I wouldn't put them in like my top 3 or 5. They're not my not they're my favorites, but that was still one of the best shows I've ever seen. It was phenomenal. It was brilliant, and hearing those songs live, in there as a whole, front to back, was something to behold. It really was.
It's just such a huge album. My dad was talking about this one earlier today, and he was saying, when that came out, like Jeff Tate was being dubbed as, he's going to be the next huge singer, he's going to be the next one, he's going to be the next kind of almost the next Robert Plant. It was kind of like people were like, wow, this guy is like, the bee's knees. It had that much of an impact, this record. People were starting to go, oh, hang on a minute, this is going to be the next huge band. But yes, this album in particular, for me, it's the pinnacle of Queensryche. It's, arguably one of the best albums of the 80s. For those reasons, it's got to be my number 3.
A lot of people will probably be screaming at the telly and devices whenever they're watching it and asking why this is a number 1. But it's 2, and it's arguably one of the greatest albums of all time. And it's Iron Maiden with Number of the Beast. It kept flicking in and out of 1. I'll be honest, it was very nearly number 1. The first album, of course, with Bruce Dickinson, Paul Di'Anno, having done obviously Self-Titled and Killers, which are both incredible records. But this really, it's a defining album for Maiden. Again, a band that have always constantly continued pushing themselves and being, every album's great. But and 22 Acacia Avenue, that's all I've got to say. Like, you can't argue with the songs on this album again. Hallowed Be Thy Name, Prisoner, Children of the Damned, obviously Run to the Hills and Number of the Beast as well. I think it's insane that many classic Maiden songs are on one album. I mean, it's even more insane that they've got albums that also have that many classic Iron Maiden songs, you know what I mean? But it felt like this was a real flag in the ground kind of moment, and this is where we're turning, this is where we're going. The Killers and Iron Maiden itself, arguably more punk rock in their kind of approach and their ability, and this sounded like they were gonna have those more progressive elements and there's more complicated time structures, and then Bruce comes in with his, the air raid siren and it at its prime and peak, and it just smashes all over, in my opinion, most things that were going on at the time. I was only about, I don't know when this came out, 93, 84, I was like -4 or something, but
82.
There you go, I was -5. I wasn't even born. I don't think my parents had even met yet. But it's just one of those things that seem to be completely, and it's one of those ones where, when you see any top 50 greatest albums or rock albums or 50 greatest metal albums, it's one that's consistently comes up as a defining moment, not only for Iron Maiden, but for the genre of rock and for the genre of heavy metal. It's, for me, an incredible record. I don't know how it would have sounded had Paul Di'Anno stayed. But if's a short word, but it's a big word, isn't it? At the end of the day, if Paul Di'Anno had stayed, but it's an incredible record. I mean, we were saying that, I said earlier about Ben Shepherd coming on and doing Bad Motorfinger with his first album with Soundgarden. Bruce Dickinson coming on his first record with Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast. What?
Yeah.
That must have just been insane at the time for anyone who was like, sitting there waiting for, this is obviously years and years and years before social media, and you would have even had a little peek. You would have just had to wait to, there's your record, deal with it. And anyone who was a Maiden fan and waiting for the sound of this new vocalist coming in, and they come out with Number of the Beast, I can't even imagine what that must have been like. It's without doubt, you hear those songs live now. I mean, I can't tell you how happy I was last time when I saw Maiden. It was Download 2022 was the last time I saw them. And I threw 22 Acacia into the set. It's just, it's one of those moments where you're like, they're doing 22 Acacia. Don't get me wrong, there's certain songs that you're kind of like, if I don't hear Run to the Hills, that's fine. There's amazing, amazing songs that they do. Them do Run to the Hills, always very good. But it's just the rest of the songs on this album.
It could be a best of. It's one, yeah. Like, it feels like it. It's got that kind of vibe to it, My number 2. It's so difficult at this point. It's I mean, I'm looking at it now and I'm like, do I jostle this? Do I make a decision? But I'll stick with it. My number 2, it's Metallica with Master of Puppets.
Oh shit.
You've done it again. Hey.
We found it.
Hey, so we got 2 episodes, and at least we got another one. Yes, Master of Puppets came out in 1986. The final album to feature Cliff, of course. You got all the classics there. Battery, Master of Puppets, obviously the title track there. Disposable Heroes. I've always loved The Thing That Should Not Be. For me, this is kind of, I've always debated, it's like either Master of Puppets or the Black Album. That's kind of the pinnacle. It's that those are the two for me that are like jostling for the top of the tree for Metallica records. Um, it kind of depends on what day it is, what way the wind's blowing, isn't it? It's that close for me anyway. Um, yeah, I think that this is just an incredible album. If you look at what they had previously and then they released this one, it's like this one is another level entirely. Prior to this, they had Ride the Lightning, and it's just for me, I think it just smashes it out the water. I like that album, but it's another level entirely. There's something about this one in particular, it's like multi-generational. It just doesn't age. It's transcended just every genres. It's another one where a lot of people that maybe don't like metal, they've heard this one. Yeah, it's a special album. I mean, again, it's a lot of these songs will remain in the Metallica set list, won't they? They're immovable. You can't not play Master of Puppets. You can't not have these kind of ones in there. Yeah, for me, it has to be at least in that kind of top three, top two conversation. Yeah, for me, it's like a quintessential third album. If you want to kind of advance your band and not kind of completely change, but just move to that next level, like this is the one, isn't it? One of the ones that you say, yeah. For me, Master of Puppets was that benchmark moment for Metallica where they moved up. Yeah, so it is my number two.
I've never seen the download crowd more. I've seen them equally excited, but I've never seen a crowd at Download Festival more excited than when Metallica headlined in 2006 for the 20th anniversary did Master of Puppets in its entirety.
Mm.
There was guys my age at the time, 18, 19, to guys who saw it first time round and beyond, and everyone was just stood there in awe of this incredible album getting played from front to back. And they did it kind of mid in the set as well, so it was kind of like an anticipation thing. They did a few songs, then they kicked into Master of Puppets set, and then they finished with a sort of few more. It was just like bang in the middle, and it'd been an incredible day, great festival. Generally, obviously, downloadable, best, arguably the biggest rock and metal festival in the country, and it's always a good day. But still to this day, that set, me and Joe did our download favorite kind of sets, kind of special on the radio show, and we both agreed we were both there that year. We went together at the time, but we were both there. But we both agreed that Metallica Master of Puppets set, it's got to be in the top three. It's just got to be. Yeah, great choice, man. And I can't believe I forgot it. It was going to be one, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've just remembered one now, so it's kind of fucked my list a little bit. So I'm going to kind of throw it in as I would put it in my top four or top five. So I'm going to throw it in now as kind of it's worth mentioning, right? Jimi Hendrix, Electric Ladyland.
Yeah.
Came out in 1968, third and final album. Obviously, it's got loads of iconic tracks there, like Voodoo Child, Crosstown Traffic, All Along the Watchtower. But where would I put it? Jesus Christ. It's, there's so many of these.
1.5.
Yeah, it's like, it's so tough. I mean, who would you drop? I mean, that could be a question for people. Who are you going to put in here? Are you going to drop any of these off? Are you going to shoehorn in Hendrix there? Yes, let us know because we're having a bit of a conundrum here. But your number one, the big moment here.
Yeah, my number one. Don't think anybody knows me too well. I'll be too surprised. A pinnacle album for this band for me. The band being in my opinion, the greatest band of all time. And it's Aerosmith with Toys in the Attic.
Thank God you remembered this one. I was going to say, if you hadn't have mentioned this, I'd have been like, you do realize we're going to have to record this again.
I would have had to go and cut out my Aerosmith tattoo, mate. I would have been ostracized from the Blue Army. Um, uh, it's hard for me to pick a favorite album in their career, but this third album was without doubt a defining moment. The debut, you've got Dream On and Mama Kid, the second album, Get Your Wings, had Same Old Song and Dance and All the Thighs. But Toys in the Attic has big 10-inch record, No More, No More, Sweet Emotion, the title track itself, Toys in the Attic, and of course Walk This Way and Sweet Emotion as well. You just can't argue the songs on this album. The band wrote most of the album. I think I'm right in saying they had like 3 songs written before they went into the studio, and
Right.
everything else was written while they were recording.
Well,
They weren't in the studio for months on end. I think they were in the studio for about 6 weeks. I seem to remember from an interview I saw once. And Joe Perry said it himself, and I saw. I was looking back through some bits and pieces. Toys for him had the most important songs he ever wrote that we ever wrote. He said in his world, it set a precedent, like how they were going to work going forward. It was hit in stride. And then, some people would argue that, after that, after Toys, they did, Rocks and Draw the Line, and Pump and Permanent Vacation and all the other albums that followed after that. But if you've got Walk This Way on an album, Emotion and Toys in the Attic, and You See Me Crying, I can't get over it. You just keep looking back and you think, you wrote most of this album whilst you were recording. It's insane what they did with it. I mean, the album's left like a huge legacy. Obviously, there's the reworking with Walk This Way with Run DMC. There's all the kind of samples and trip loops that followed in the hip hop scene that got used on this record. I mean, that's how the whole Run DMC thing happened, because when hip hop was starting off, there wasn't no one had pre-recorded hip hop beats. They were making their own and taking out samples of other things and making stuff up. And Aerosmith had that right kind of percussive tone to it and thing, and it was getting used a lot. And Walk This Way was just something that Run DMC boys just used to muck around with, and that's how it came to be, doing collaboration. Obviously, they recently announced, Aerosmith, that they were retiring from the touring road after Steven Tyler's vocal injury. It's not come back up to scratch. And obviously a lot of that followed with a lot of other musicians making their condolences and sharing memories on seeing Aerosmith and what have you. And Toys in the Attic was one of the albums that kept getting brought up in those conversations.
Yeah.
Pinnacle albums for people. Nikki Sixx and Motley Crue did the status about walking in to a record shop and coming out with the first Aerosmith record, and then kind of immediately, as soon as he could, go back and buy those first sort of 5 albums, including Toys. And it's just an album that seems to have struck a chord, not only with me growing up, and again, vinyl bonus points, but equally, like, musicians that I also love have been hit by this record. And the ripple effect there of that, to bands today, they'll cite another record, but that's been terribly influenced by Toys. And still, I mean, I'd challenge anyone to come up with a cooler riff than Walk This Way, or a cooler bass lick than Sweet Emotion, or a cooler drum back than Toys. I mean, the riff in Toys is great, but Joey's just on that backbeat, and he's you watch Joey Kramer play the drums on, he's so far back in his stall, you think he's going to fall off. He's just so swing. Even Steven Tyler said, that Toys in the Attic was when he knew that they'd made it. When they made that record, he knew it was a longevity statement. It wasn't we're a flash in the pan, we just got to write something to get it out. That was a statement record to make, and that was his first flag in the ground, so to speak. And we're around to do this until we can't. And 50 years after that album came out, they had to bow out, after the injury. And 54 years, if you start a career, and at 76 years old was going out, still doing, screaming his lungs out and everything else. It's incredible what they've achieved. throughout their career. And I really do think that Toys in the Attic was the start of that trajectory
Mm.
for them. First two albums are great, but there's no doubt the impact the Toys had. So for that reason, my number one.
I mean, I think it's probably the one for me. I mean, I'm not as big of an Aerosmith guy as you, but like, I'd say it's probably the pinnacle in my view. In terms of that material, it's again, it's like, you look at that set list, is all of a lot of these big ones there are going to be towards the end of that set list, and I always think that's the sign, isn't it, of possibly your best album. And on Aerosmith, I have so much respect for them saying, you know what, rather than us just rolling out Steven Tyler or doing what a few of other bands have done, where they've gone and just fetched somebody in to fill in.
Yeah.
And it's not actually that band, really, is it? I mean, if you imagine Aerosmith without Steven Tyler, that'd be bizarre. Yeah, and I respect them for doing that, for going, you know what, we can't perform as we want to. It can't be to this level that we want to do it. So we're going to go out now. We're going to go out on this high, on this pinnacle, rather than drag it out. I could name some bands here that have gone on for too long. And, like there's a few. And I think it's the right thing to do, and I think that people will then it's not tainted, is it? It's not oh well, they probably should have finished earlier than what they did. Obviously we know this is the farewell tour anyway, but
yeah,
you don't want the latter half to be people going, oh well, this sounds weird, or this isn't right.
And
You
when it was announced, like the other Friday, when they put the statement out,
Mm.
people know I love Aerosmith, so I got a lot of mates messaging me and saying, "Oh, what do you think of this?" And I was like, "Well, I'm I'm gutted that I'll never see them again."
Yeah.
First gig I ever went to, good couple of gigs with my dad, was Aerosmith, including the very first one he ever took me to. Seen them live since. Well, basically every time they've been in the country, I've been there.
Mm.
Since my dad took me when I was an 11-year-old kid in 1999. But equally, like the last time I saw them, which was Download Festival, when they headlined that, they were still cool as fuck.
Yeah.
Still absolutely on it, Don't get around that point, Steven Tyler would have been like 70, 71.
Which is just ridiculous still to be at that level.
And, it goes to Dream On, and you're waiting for that classic Dream On scream. And it's that thing where you're going, oh, he's 71 now. I've not seen him for a few years. Please still be able to do this. Please to do this. And he fucking knocks it out of the park. And you're just like, they can still do this. This is cool. I can genuinely walk away and go, these boys have still got it. Joe Perry's there, rips his shirt off, and he's just as lean and ripped as he's ever been. Like, you're 70, will you go away?
Yeah.
That's not fair.
Yeah.
Tom Hamilton's there just rocking it. He's someone who just seems to get cooler with age. Brad Whitford's the young son hero of that band, in my opinion, coming up with riffs like No More, No More, that's on the Toys in the Attic, and Last Child, and all these other licks that he's come up with, and a phenomenal guitarist. And Jerry Kramer's just on the backbeat, just doing what he does and holding it down and being, in my opinion, one of the most underrated drummers ever. He's just so energetic, so hard hitting, so solid, and he's just right on the beat, even when he's nearly fallen off his chair because he's just trying to get that swing on. He drives a song, or he makes it hold, and that was one of the best times I've ever seen them. And they were all then in their late 60s and or 70s. And if that's the last time I'm going to see them, I'm happy with that.
That's what I'm saying. I'm glad, because it doesn't.
I wouldn't want to see them.
Yeah.
And gone, if that backing guy who was doing the Dream On scream, or tell he was struggling with this a little bit these days, or they shouldn't have done this song, or they shouldn't have done this cut, or whatever. I wouldn't want that. Last time I see them is still at the top of their game, and I'm gutted that is a chapter of my life. It's been a big chapter of my life that's come to an end. But you got to give it to him for going, you know what, we can't get back to where we want to be. Steven Tyler has had this horrendous vocal injury. I mean, he fractured his larynx. I mean, Jesus. I didn't even know you.
Yeah. I didn't know that was a thing until I saw the article. I was like, right, okay.
I remember seeing the article that came out and they're saying, oh, Steven Tyler's had some blood in his throat after the performance. And you're like, well,
Mm,
that sounds nasty in itself. And then a couple of days later, it's like, oh, actually, it's more than that. He's actually fractured his larynx and it's going to be like a year to recover. And you're like, whoa, okay, that's not cool. And I had some friends of mine who went down to go see the Black Crows in London, and he pops up and does Mummikin with the Black Crows. And Jack, Jack Hutchinson.
mm,
Jack messaged me saying, "Dude, you're going to wish you were here." And I did, and I thought, oh, brilliant. Well, he's singing something.
mm.
But obviously, Mummikin isn't the higher end of his register.
Yeah.
It's a very bluesy, stompy song. And you just think, okay, but even at that point, they go, we can't go out and do it how we've always done it. Therefore, we're not going to do it.
Mm.
And like you say, you just got to respect that.
I think it's great. You could have sat there and just picked up the paycheck for the remaining dates of the last tour. You could have done that.
Yeah.
As you say there, you could have got him back in singers, as many have done in the past. You could have done the thing where, when your voice is given out, they usually just do that to the crowd. Because it's like, we know you're fucked. Like, you're finished, right? Your voice is gone. And you know what? He's 70 odd years old. Nothing wrong with calling it a day at this point. I mean, what a career. And, you look back at Toys in the Attic in particular, which we were speaking about, and, I think many will say that's the pinnacle. And as you say, the influence, that album in particular as well, the influence of that record is undeniable. Yes, I completely get why it would be your number one. I'd have been stunned if it wasn't your number one. I'd have just thought, oh, he's obviously forgotten it. But yes, my number one, the one that is missing from the list, it is, of course, Iron Maiden with Number of the Beast. It came out in 1982. As we mentioned there, it's like a best of. But I remember, like, this was the album that kind of introduced me to Iron Maiden. I remember when I was a kid, so I got all the hand-me-down stuff. So I got I was on tapes. So my dad would write me out these tapes of bands that he thought I'd be into. And usually you would have it's nice writing at the top, but as further down it goes, you realize he's running out of room, so it gets smaller and smaller writing, so you can't read the stuff at the bottom end. But yeah, in that collection of tapes was Iron Maiden, Number of the Beast, and I put this one on, and I was just like, wow, like, this band is fantastic. Like, obviously then, this is Bruce's first one in. I mean, I look at stuff like Children of the Damned, Hallowed Be Thy Name. Obviously you've got your stuff like Run to the Hills and that, but even the first track, Invaders, I think that's such a great song. For me at the time, it was like, because me particularly, I mean, even now I'm still a big kind of film fan, but I was always kind of like a film and TV kind of kid. I was I was into music, but I wasn't really kind of down on it. But this was like the bridge, because if you look at this album, there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of crossovers here to that kind of world. You look at the Prisoner, so that's based on the TV show from the 70s called The Prisoner. And you got stuff that, ties in. It's like stories, Run to the Hills, Children of the Damned. It's based on that kind of famous old movie by the similar name there. It's it has these connections. It's that kind of telling a story. It's almost it goes right back to the campfire kind of thing, doesn't it? People telling stories. And I always gravitate towards that kind of stuff. And for me, this was kind of the bridge between those two worlds of movies and TV shows to music. It was that door. And me as a teenager, this was kind of the one. This was the album that was like my favorite album. I'd always play it. It was the thing, you're kind of nostalgia. You always had, particularly when I was growing up, you had the kids that were listening to, Lord knows what. But I was kind of going through this bizarre 80s era. Like I was different to the other kids. I was wearing like can you remember like the high top kind of Adidas kind of looking things from the early 80s? I was wearing those kind of things when I was like 16. So people were like, well, who is this guy? But I was just going through that thing, the tight trousers like Bruce had with the spandex almost and all that kind of stuff. Again, you look at the influence that this record has had, and
Yeah.
Jesus, like how many bands have been influenced by this album and the following ones, particularly throughout the 80s that Maiden did. I think this started off a golden era for Iron Maiden. Right the way through the 80s, I'd say, to, like right towards the end, when you had stuff like Seventh Son of a Seventh Son,
Right.
It's just this golden era that goes right the way through. I mean, just great stuff. And, you look at the old kind of live video tours from that era, and it's just like, this is peak kind of, Bruce is at his peak. The band feels like they're at their peak. I think they just have everything, right? And it's like what I was saying with Metallica. It's like it's a multi-generation thing. As I say, when I was the teenage years, it was this album and a couple of others. There was like Judas Priest and Sabbath and all these kind of older ones that I really gravitated towards. And you see it now. If you go to a Maiden gig now and look through the crowd, it's bizarre. It's like you've got like three generations here now, which is really interesting. You've got teenagers, you've got the adults, and then you've now got like people that could be your grandfather. It's like this three generational thing. And yeah, the legacy of this album in particular, it's, some may argue, I know that a lot of people are out there for Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, I know people love that one, but you could definitely say it's their most successful record. Yeah, I think, it's the best. I mean, 22 Acacia Avenue, as you mentioned there. I love that one. Yeah, there's so many great ones, but I mean, I've always loved Children of the Down in particular. I think that was just such a cool song. Start to finish, though, it's just an absolute classic album. And, again, it's, as we mentioned with vinyl, it's like, it is a quintessential album to own on vinyl.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's got everything. I mean, even the cover art, it's just iconic from start to finish, isn't it? The cover, the music, everything. It's got everything that you want. Yeah. So even now, if you were to hand this to a teenager, it'd be like, what? Like a kid that's not heard of Maiden before. They'd be like, what is this? This is cool. It could come out today, I think, and be an absolute smash hit.
Absolutely. It's one of those albums where, like, I know you say, when you're doing interviewing guests on the show and you'll ask them,
Mm.
what album would you like to have been a witness to in terms of
Yeah.
recording and writing? I'd love to have been there when they were writing this.
Mm.
See the process, like, how did you go from Maiden and Killers to
Yeah.
this?
Because it is, for me, it's the biggest. If you look at all of these bands that we've had, I think between album 2 and 3, Maiden have the largest jump in quality. I know there's Diano fans out there, but if you look at the overall quality, the songwriting, everything, there is a huge leap here. It's another level entirely. I mean, my dad commented about this. When he saw Maiden with Diano, and then again, kind of recently after Bruce had joined. And he said it was like, this is a different band. It feels like a whole new level entirely. Just everything felt on a different level. And it was, I think Bruce Dickinson was kind of the missing piece of the puzzle. He was the right fit for that band at that time. Yeah. I mean, what an impact. So for me, it had to be the number one because of the jumping quality as well from the previous two records to this one, and the legacy and just everything about it. It's one of my personal favorite albums. I know it's a cliche thing to say, "Oh, Number of the Beast" nowadays, but if you look at that track list, it kind of speaks for itself, right?
Absolutely, man. Absolutely.
So yes, we have made it to the end. If you've made it to the end of this video, well done. Of course, we want to hear from you. I'm sure that you're gonna give us a top 10, and there'll be something in there that we'll both go, oh my God, I've forgotten about such and such. Yeah, so we're interested to hear from you. Comment below with your top 10. And, do you want to see us do fourth albums? Because I've had a look at fourth albums, and I think that there are, again, surprisingly, some absolutely banging albums that you don't really realize an album for. So I think there is something there. I think there's a topic there to discuss, and but throw us in your third albums. It could be your number one. It could be your whole top 10. We want to hear from you, but we'll see you next time, no doubt with the fourth albums, I imagine. But yes, until then, check out Carmine Apiece. I've recently released that interview. And you can also have a look at Lee's latest interview, whichever that will be at the time of this release. It will be here somewhere. So go and check that out as well. And we'll see you next time.